Welcome to our MidWeek podcast. These are conversations between pastors and theologians, members of our church staff, focused on our current sermon series and how we understand the purpose and the value of this particular series at this particular moment. So in these conversations, we'll explore why are we studying this text or this topic and why right now? How might this contribute to the faithfulness, discipleship, and formation of us as individuals and as a community? We hope you enjoy. Hi there. Welcome to our MC4 podcast, our midweek. This is another episode on Ezra Nehemiah. I'm John. I'm here with Pastor Chris. And we've had one conversation already, the two of us, about Ezra Nehemiah, in which we just explored in fairly general, fairly broad terms the question of why our church would seek to engage with this particular part of the Christian scriptures at this particular moment. And it was a great conversation where we sort of explored some of the dynamics and complexities of this particular moment within the biblical narrative, within the history of God's people, and how it might have both elements of sort of difference and distance from us in our moment, but also elements of correspondence and analogy that we might learn from. And so we spoke a little bit about what it might look like for us to try to kind of connect the dots. So I thought with this episode, we might continue along that trajectory and maybe even press into it a little bit more deeply in certain areas, picking up on some of the things that came up in that conversation. So, for example, one of the things that we talked a little bit about in the last episode was some of these strange episodes associated with some kind of conflict in the books of Ezra and Nehemiah. And you mentioned, Chris, that in some of those episodes, we kind of are often left scratching our heads, right? These aren't the kinds of narratives that say, tell a story, present someone as a moral exemplar or an exemplary leader, and then say, now go and do likewise. They kind of just present some stuff that happened, some decisions that were made, and then you're kind of left going, okay, was that a good thing or a bad thing? Was that the right decision or the wrong decision? How do I sort of make sense of this? So I wonder if one way that we could kind of press into this next conversation here is, I wonder if you could just sort of, eventually what I'm hoping we can do is sort of talk about some of these episodes and then how we might engage with them from our own perspective in our own particular moment. But maybe to begin with, would you mind just sort of sketching for us some of these episodes and some of what it is that makes the story of Ezra and Nehemiah a little bit complex, like we talked about last time, and a little bit makes it a little bit unclear for us sort of what exactly we're supposed to take from these books or do with them.
I can think of two or three immediately off the top of my head. One I just recently taught on, Ezra 4, going into Ezra 5. It's the moment where foundation is laid and temple's being actively pursued, rebuilt. And the peoples of the land, which are now in the land for quite a while. Israel had been in exile for some time. These are actually peoples that it would seem were brought over by the Assyrian king. So even before the Babylonians, right? So we're talking a couple hundred years plus potentially that these people have been in the land, and true to form, as was very much the custom of the nations at the time, worshiping multiple deities. So they picked up the worship of Yahweh, picked up the worship of the Lord, the God of the land. So as they came to the Jewish peoples who had the very specific task, they came and they offered to help. And again, this is a narrative text, right? So it doesn't necessarily tell us the motivation of the people offering to help. But what we quickly see, what we see definitively, is that the help is rejected and there seems to be a response to the rejection. There's a mutuality of rejection. And what we're left with is trying to discern, or asking questions of the text that it doesn't necessarily fully answer. And And I think that's part of the reason, like in our own ambiguous moment, the ambiguity of the text, like, hey, there's ambiguity here and there. And so we just enter into that and we ask questions and we attempt now for us by the power and person of the Spirit to actually discern a righteous way in the midst of the ambiguity, right?
Yeah.
The point isn't the ambiguity. It's like, okay, Lord, help us in the ambiguity discern a righteous way, a merciful way, a just way, a way that reflects who you actually really are. So in this moment of help offered and rejected and then responsiveness, the peoples of the land did not take that lying down. So whether we want to blame the people of God, question whether they had the right response, whether Zerubbabel and Joshua, Yeshua had the right response. I mean, that's a worthy question to ask of the text. But also, everyone's culpable. It's not like just one party is the problem. Everybody's the problem. But the problem impacts what's going on. The work slows down. It's not fulfilled immediately. So we see like the tension between all of this and what God had fostered to happen. What he had declared was the express purpose of their return. So you have that. Later you have Ezra returning many years later, 6 decades later, 60, 65 years later. And temple is in place. Worship, the form is there. But there's so much substance lacking. The people are ignorant of Torah. They have not access to Torah. Their worship is very, very misshapen, ill-informed. And Ezra, this Torah lover, the student of the Torah, just passionately calls the people to the heart of the matter. But in the midst of that, you see issues of intermarriage with the peoples. You see response, like, what do we do with that? And you see separation of peoples. And you're just like, was that a merciful and just outcome? What were the outcomes? Were the actions taken, the decisions made and the actions taken, were those the right ones? And I think it's really presumptuous of us to either say absolutely or definitely not.
Sure.
I think it really is presumptuous. So I'm not even inclined to do that. I just go, okay, this just doesn't seem like it fully fits the prophetic promises, which reflect the person and heart of God. So where there's a disconnect between that and what we're actually seeing, like, why is that? And so that's another one, right? And then later in Nehemiah, I mean, the moment Nehemiah leaves to go back to tend to the king that he once, that commissioned him, as soon as Nehemiah is gone, right? I mean, the people just revert to all their old practice. Like it's almost like the text suggests, like, what's that proverbial phrase when the cat's gone, the mice come out and play?
Oh, sure.
I butchered that a little bit
either, but
that whole thing. Like they were just the guy in charge is gone, so now let's do what we really want to do, or let's do what we normally do.
Yeah.
And so Nehemiah returns, and he's just, I mean, honestly, it's just, I had to be for a spiritual leader. I, in his shoes, I'd just be so disillusioned. I'm gone for a few years, guys. And look at you. Yeah. What a sorry bunch you are. And his response to that, his leadership solutions. And you just go, okay. So when a lot of that is still to come in our study, we haven't even touched the specifics of the persons of Ezra and Nehemiah and their specific actions. Lots done right, lots done potentially wrong.
Yeah.
Or potentially not in keeping. Not tied closely to the prophetic promises and the character of God in the midst of those promises. There's a real dissonance between those. Yeah. And so we're just left more with right? Everything started, we're going back. This is the moment, right? Renewal, revival.
Yeah.
Look what God's doing. And when you get to the end of the story, you're like, okay.
Yeah. So maybe part of what I hear you saying is that, so there are these episodes, you did a really nice job of just sort of sketching some of those episodes that run, I mean, it's a number of episodes, but you could also think of that as a kind of theme or motif that is a trajectory that you can trace throughout this sort of dual narrative within this one book, two-part kind of story. And I think what I hear you saying is that as we read, as we engage, as we try to interpret these texts and try to understand how they might speak to us today as Scripture, maybe one of the least helpful approaches would be, well, they didn't accept help from outsiders with what they were trying to do as the people of God, so we should do the same, right? We just do what they, that's sometimes how we treat the Bible.
Totally.
Read what it says, do what they do. What's the bumper sticker? The Bible says it. Bible says it. I believe it. That settles it, or something like that. I guess it's not exactly that.
Yeah, but it's
that sort of like monkey see, monkey
Enough
do
said.
kind of thing.
Yeah, yeah.
Maybe that's too harsh. But, we sometimes treat the Bible that way, or assume that we ought to treat the Bible that way, that you just see what's happening in the text and you're like, I guess that's what we're supposed to do. But what I hear you saying is that that's probably not what these texts are there for, to say like, follow this precise example. If people who are sort of outsiders to the people of God offer help for what we're doing, we should reject it and be insulated and only do our own thing. Or the intermarriage thing even. I mean, there are and have been sort of tragic and awful ways that those texts have been interpreted in Christian history, as if, well, this just gives us a model, and anyone who's an outsider, whether that means Christians shouldn't marry outside of the Christian faith, or even when it's been interpreted in sort of racial terms, and people have tried to sort of twist the Scriptures in those kinds of unfortunate ways. So what I hear you saying is that those are obviously not the most helpful approaches to the text, and certainly the text doesn't say sort of like, this is how you're supposed to do this in every situation. But you're also saying these are ambiguous narratives, complex narratives, but the point isn't just the ambiguity, like, well, isn't this what life is like? Throw your hands up and kind of go, I don't know.
Yeah.
I don't know what we're supposed to do.
And do whatever is right in your own eyes.
Yeah. Instead, you're suggesting that these narratives might invite us into sort of wrestling with the complexity and engaging in a process of discernment, guided by the Spirit of God and guided perhaps by aspects of what are going on in these texts, but not in a just sort of, So if we were to try to press into that discernment, I mean, obviously in the context of our sermons on Sundays, that's a great way to, or a great sort of and fairly obvious moment in which that we can press into that as the people of God. But maybe just thinking of it broadly in this conversation, what are the dynamics of that tension and that needed discernment? Like, what are maybe to begin with, what are the understandable elements of the motivation behind some of these things, like being concerned about accepting help from outsiders or being concerned about intermarriage? What are the sort of underlying elements of concern facing the people of God as they return to God?
I think we could immediately go to the Ezra 4 text and enter into the tension. Try to understand why the people would have potentially responded the way they did. Whether it was right, whether it was wrong. The why. What's the why behind it, right? So they're back. They got sent into exile for idolatry. They were introduced to idolatry by the nations surrounding them who worshipped other gods. I think, it would be easy just to come to the conclusion, well, the problem is the other nations.
Sure.
The problem is the gods of the other nations. And to be sure, that's a problem. I'm not suggesting it. But the answer is, okay, we just stay away from them. Like, we have nothing to do with them. Well, that's an answer. But what do you do, like, when your sacred text, which they already had in their hands, suggested that Yahweh's way with them was going to be, I'm going to do something with you that invites the nations to who I am. Now, there are also scriptures that cause when they were going into the land of promise, the Lord did say very specific, I don't want these particular peoples. I'm telling you right now in this moment, like, it's a problem.
Yeah.
Right? You do have that. So where did the people of God maybe stop using discernment in their moment in time and just point it at the sacred text and say, well, right here it says, don't have anything to do with...
Sure.
And they kind of universalized that. At every point, at every stop in their story.
Yeah.
Or what if the people of God, both from their understanding of the text, but also a lack of understanding of their own hearts? Like, we're not supposed to have anything to do. And by the way, I don't want to go back to where we were. And so you are a potential threat that ties me somehow. You're a bridge that gets me back to where we were. And so, no, you're bad. I don't know you. I don't have anything to do with you, but you're bad. You're a threat to me. You're a threat to me. And at the heart of that is fear. All right, so when we look at the stories that make up our scriptures, I think one of the questions to ask for discernment is how much brokenness, how much fear actually inform decision making, and how does that then inform our own moment, right? Like one of the questions I posed recently on a Sunday was, have we even grappled with how afraid we really are? Like how many decisions we make as an individual or as a collective people of God based primarily out of fear. And it's not so much, when I say that, it's not so much like, oh, I'm afraid of COVID. Sure. No. And maybe that's where some people's minds go, but more like, I'm so afraid of that influence. I'm so afraid. So I'm going to isolate myself. I'm going to inoculate myself. I'm going to, right? And we actually form our lives far more around fear of what could be a threat than what? Than a life marked by the security of a relationship with Jesus. And maybe that's a too generalized statement, but
I like the way you're framing it, though. I mean, I think what I hear you saying is that part of what's motivating the people in this larger moment and in these isolated episodes that we're talking about seems to be a genuine and good aspect of their sort of identity and mission and self-understanding as the people of God, right? They've been called to be a kingdom of priests, a set-apart people, right? Holy to God. Not, and as you said, from Deuteronomy 7 to the book of Joshua to all sorts of texts, there are so many aspects of the Hebrew Bible that speak to the importance of God's covenant people being distinctive in their identity, right? Devoted to Yahweh alone. Very clearly, Yahweh is your only God, and avoid any kind of following after other gods, making idols. All of these kinds of things are just so obviously central to the Old Testament storyline, to the Old Testament witness. And yet what I think what I hear you saying is that aspect of what's probably motivating people is understandable and proper and right and makes a lot of sense in the context of sort of, okay, we're returning from exile. Let's not make the same mistakes we did before. Let's preserve our distinctive identity. Let's preserve our holiness. Let's recover Torah, rebuild the temple. Let's do everything right this time. And yet it's possible that part of what makes these episodes complicated and invites us into this process of discernment is what if even those legitimate dynamics of wanting to maintain holiness and a distinctive identity as the people of God were also sort of clouded by a fear that then didn't allow the people to recognize other aspects of their heritage, which include this notion of God, initially making a covenant with Abraham for the sake of blessing all the families of the earth, not just so that the people could be distinctive and enjoy blessing on their own, or the prophet Isaiah's stuff about sort of the people of God being a light to all the other nations, or all the nations streaming into Jerusalem, and all of those, and I mean, I think that even that dynamic can help us to sort of connect the dots in the way that you and I talked about in our last conversation, in the sense of, I think if we're honest, it's not at all uncommon for us to treat our scriptures and our identity in a similar kind of way. I mean, you think about the amount of different denominations, the amount of different expressions of Christianity that often find themselves at odds with one another, like, we are the faithful remnant, you all must not be, this kind of thing. And so often what we end up doing is we have these isolated pockets of sort of Christian identity where we might gravitate towards certain parts of the scriptures, but then out of fear or self-interest or whatever it might be, we might kind of ignore some of these other parts. And so we'll sort of highlight this part and say, we've really got it figured out. They seem to only care about this part and clearly don't have it figured out, or whatever it might be.
Yeah.
But I really think you're sort of putting your finger on something helpful and important for us to consider, in that perhaps in a similar way to the folks that we read about in Ezra Nehemiah, we might need to reckon with the extent to which we too might, our motivation might sometimes be clouded by fear as well. So if we kind of speak even more explicitly about our own situation, I mean, it feels to me like there are plenty of potential dots to be connected, even if we want to do it in a kind of nuanced way, right? We find ourselves in a contemporary situation in which obviously what it means for us to be Christians has to involve a pursuit of holiness and a sense of this distinctive identity we need to have as the people of God. And as we pursue that, it's not hard to recognize that we live within a culture that people often refer to as secular or post-Christian. And so it's either, at the very least, it's different from our distinctive identity. At worst, it sometimes feels hostile to our distinctive identity, or a potential threat, a potential source of compromise. Even beyond our immediate culture, there's this sort of globalized world that's more and more interconnected all the time. And even if it's not necessarily secular or post-Christian, it has a myriad of other sort of gods and worldviews and sort of, which again can be perceived as a threat. What would your pastoral guidance be to us, either drawing on Ezra Nehemiah or even just speaking sort of more broadly in terms of like, how might we discern what the Spirit of God might be up to among us right now? How might we discern what it could look like to pursue faithfulness, to pursue holiness and a distinctive identity as the people of God, without just being sort of so fearful of the outside world that we just sort of insulate and hide or reject all forms of sort of interaction, that kind of thing? How do you think we might navigate that tension?
Yeah. Where should we land? I appreciate the question. Well, let's just use Ezra 4, and maybe I can dive into a specific or two of our situation. So there's an exchange between the peoples of the land and the newly repurposed Israelites in the land. There's a rejection of the help offered, and then there's serious opposition given to discourage the effort. Well, if you're not going to include us, then we're going to do anything in our power to disrupt, dissuade, and discourage you. So again, as we've already stated, everybody's part of the problem here, right? We called this on Sunday the polarization
Sure.
of everyone involved in the story, which we get polarization. So what are we polarized around right now? What do I see, right, in terms of the people of God? So COVID has introduced just something I couldn't have anticipated. And kudos to anyone who did, though I'm not sure I know of anyone who fully anticipated this.
Sure.
But there's because of COVID and because of governmental civic leaders making decisions, there's been a whole conversation around religious liberties, quote unquote, around the conversation of how do we view our disposition towards civic leaders. These are not men and women who, by and large, are openly confessing followers of Jesus. And even if they are, sometimes we still disagree with them.
Sure.
that alone doesn't guarantee we'll go, oh yeah, that leader, well, I can trust that leader. So this whole conversation about how should we respond as a church, whether it be a whole movement or just a local church such as ours, how do we respond to this moment? So at play are many things. What's the motivation of the civic leader? And unfortunately, one thing I've seen in many followers of Jesus, in our church and many others, is this deep, deep, deep-seated suspicion that our civic leaders are ill-motivated, very specifically towards us as people of faith, and very specifically towards us as followers of Jesus. And therefore, they're utilizing this moment as a means to accomplish a sinister agenda. And that agenda involves, in some way, shape, or form, whether they know it or not, that they are part of a bigger picture of colluding against the people of God, which, by the way, our religious freedoms are like the end-all be-all to us. Like, that's our promised land. And if anything threatens our promised land, well. And so what I found, and I'll go as far as to call it duplicitous idolatry, we have accepted nationalism as part of our belief creed when it's not. It's not a template that is offered us in the scriptures. We've accepted, so the mask. Let's just say, what would this moment be like if every confessing Christian, and I understand there's lots of disagreement. I could be doing a podcast with somebody who would sincerely disagree with me here, and they would make their points rather emphatically, and probably to many quite convincingly, right? So I acknowledge the sincerity of the disagreement and the articulation around the disagreement. But what if in this moment, those who are confessed followers of Jesus, who, as the prophet Haggai says, are very careful about the way they're living. Think about the way you live. What if mask wearing was just really simple for us? What if our true authority was the Lord and his revealed word, which we hold to be authoritative for us? So if Peter and Paul, who served under Roman rule, that did designate some unique freedoms to the Jewish peoples, but they were not autonomous. They didn't have the religious freedoms we do, not in fullness. Who, by the way, both Peter and Paul would be killed under these leaders, under this kingdom. If they both rather emphatically call followers of Jesus to deep consideration about your civic engagement, and the primary point that they both make is the attitude with which you manifest towards, the way you live towards, that you are to be adorning the gospel, causing it to be winsome, right? So so the way I think about my civic interactions is I'm actually called to adorn the gospel.
Wow.
That seems to be the apostolic exhortation.
Mm-hmm.
So rather than immediately thinking politically or suspiciously of civic leaders, which they've opened themselves up. I'm not suggesting they
Sure.
Yeah, none of this happens in a vacuum. But instead of immediately just assuming the worst, AKA making decisions based out of fear, you are after something I value. You want to take it away from me. But rather we just think, my primary call is to adorn the gospel in this moment. And the scripture is actually really, really clear. Like the main tenet. What's the most important commandment? Hear, O Israel, the Lord your God is one. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. And like it, love your neighbor as yourself. Well, honestly, and the initial presentation of mask wearing was, we don't know if it will help you, but we think it might help somebody you're interacting with.
Yeah. Yeah.
Why was this so hard for us? We need to ask that question. Because I honestly don't think, according to the scriptures, according to what we would designate as our true authority, it's that hard. We made a big thing out of this. I don't think we needed to. I don't think we needed to. And I think it's a fundamental point of failure on the part of the people of God. And I think it reveals a lot about us. And we could pick at several other issues that have been very present in COVID. Sure. But you asked about a pastoral perspective. Yeah. It's a moment that we could have rose to meet the moment.
Yeah.
I think we missed it, bro.
And
I think we did.
I think you're probably right. And I think that the way that you have interpreted that moment, that's just in our very recent history, I suppose in some ways it's still happening because people still have plenty of opinions and postures about this. But the way you're interpreting it in light of our larger conversation suggests that to some extent, there has been a temptation within the American church to be so sure of our own, so sure that we're right already in our own eyes, and so suspicious and fearsome about some kind of agenda being imposed from the outside that we place all our attention on resisting or calling out or something, that sort of external factor, and actually neglect the extent to which we might be, as you said, missing it, missing an opportunity to adorn the gospel with a kind of self-sacrificial, even if it's something as simple as wearing a bit of cloth on your face. But, willing to be inconvenienced, even if we don't know for sure the extent to which it might help, but just at because it might have the potential to do so.
I mean, think about a cultural narrative that would be very different than the one we've heard regarding the ways in which the church has responded in COVID. Imagine if the narrative was the people leading the charge, the examples of leading the charge of care for others. Like around the nation as churches gather. What if that was the narrative?
Yeah. And I think what's so helpful about this, it's one sort of isolated and in some ways very controversial sort of conversation, but I think it illuminates the broader dynamic that we're talking about. I think in every generation, in every culture, the people of God are always going to be faced with this tension of the cliche. I mean, it's from scripture, but you could say we're always called to be in the world and not of the world. We're always called to have and preserve and maintain a distinctive identity as the faithful people of God, but to do so in a way that is engaged with the wider world in terms of preaching the gospel, bearing witness to the realities of the kingdom, and even just very practical things like caring for people and loving neighbors. And
if our gospel doesn't help us in something that honestly it's pretty clear about and is pretty simple,
yeah.
Really, I mean, yeah, I won't mince words. I have no idea how many people are going to watch this, but for everyone who is, I think COVID has illumined some serious holes in just how sincere we embrace the call on our lives. And there's illumined weaknesses, but there's also the flip side to that coin is it clarifies opportunities for growth.
Yeah, that's great.
And I don't want to I've spent a fair amount of time in lament over what I've seen, discerned, and experienced. But there's also opportunity going forward for every one of us who would just go, yeah, you know what? We did miss an opportunity, a big one. Like, we have thoroughly made the primary tenets of our faith pretty unbelievable. To anyone who's discerning, I don't, do those Christians actually mean what they believe? Do they really?
Yeah.
Oof.
Yeah. And so we can take an honest look at what, at maybe an opportunity missed, and maybe not just missed, but maybe a kind of blight on our witness to some extent. But then we can also, but then I like what you're saying, that it's not as if we don't just lament that. We can also say, how might taking that seriously propel us into a kind of renewed faithfulness? And I wonder if, I think some of what you're putting your finger on in terms of our tendency to fear and to make decisions based out of that, and then the language you drew from the New Testament about adorning the gospel, I think those two realities could chart a really beautiful way forward, where if what we see outside of the walls of the church, so to speak, is what we perceive to be a secular culture, a post-Christian culture, maybe even a culture that feels somewhat hostile at times. Even if elements of that are true, we're still faced with a choice, right? Our response to that could be to we perceive hostility, so we just fight back just as hard. And so there's a kind of conflict dynamic. Our posture could be to sort of circle the wagons and isolate ourselves in a kind of extremist monastic kind of way. But to me, the language of adorning the gospel creates an image for an alternative that has, I'll just say, I mean, maybe I'm just biased, but I've always been more drawn to a kind of posture that says, regardless of what anyone's motivation is out there in the so-called sort of secular culture, what would it look like for us to get serious about cultivating a witness to the gospel and the kingdom that just is attractive and that stands on its own 2 feet, regardless of what anyone sort of on the outside does.
We are far too much concerned about what's happening out there to the negation of what's going on in here.
Well, let's hope that our engagement with the books of Ezra and Nehemiah invite us into the complexity of that, but not just into sort of complexity that we don't know what to do with, but that the Spirit of God might use these texts and this moment as an opportunity for us to discern what it might look like for us to be faithful, and then to actually pursue what Jesus might be calling us to.
Amen.
Thanks for listening. Our podcast is produced by Dave Sproul. It's edited by Tim Muchira, and we have music from Sherry Muchira. If you're enjoying these conversations, we'd love to hear from you, so please subscribe on whatever platform you're using, and we'll look forward to being in touch with you.